presents The Member of the Wedding, written by Carson McCullers, narrated by Susan Sarandon.
Part 1. It happened that green and crazy summer when Frankie was 12 years old. This was the summer when, for a long time, she had not been a member. She belonged to no club and was a member of nothing in the world. Frankie had become an unjoined person who hung around in doorways, and she was afraid. In June, the trees were bright, dizzy green, but later the leaves darkened, and the town turned black and shrunken under the glare of the sun. At first, Frankie walked around doing one thing and another. The sidewalks of the town were gray in the early morning and at night, but the noon sun put a glaze on them, so that the cement burned and glittered like glass. The sidewalks finally became too hot for Frankie's feet, and also she got herself in trouble. She was in so much secret trouble that she thought it was better to stay at home. And at home there was only Bernice Sadie Brown and John Henry West. The three of them sat at the kitchen table, saying the same things over and over, so that by August the words began to rhyme with each other and sound strange. The world seemed to die each afternoon, and nothing moved any longer. At last the summer was like a green, sick dream, or like a silent, crazy jungle under glass. And then, on the last Friday of August, all this was changed. It was so sudden that Frankie puzzled the whole blank afternoon, and still she did not understand. "It is so very queer," she said, "the way it all just happened." Happened, said Bernice. John Henry listened and watched them quietly. "I have never been so puzzled." "But puzzled about what?" "The whole thing," Frankie said. And Bernice remarked, "I believe the sun has fried your brains." "Me too," John Henry whispered. Frankie herself almost admitted maybe so. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and the kitchen was square and gray and quiet. Frankie sat at the table with her eyes half closed, and she thought about a wedding. She saw a silent church, a strange snow slanting down against the colored windows. The groom in this wedding was her brother, and there was a brightness where his face should be. The bride was there in a long white train, and the bride also was faceless. There was something about this wedding that gave Frankie a feeling that she could not name. "Look here at me," said Bernice. "You jealous." "Jealous?" "Jealous because your brother gonna be married." "No," said Frankie. "I just never saw any two people like them. When they walked in the house today, it was so queer." "You jealous," said Bernice. "Go and behold yourself in the mirror. I can see from the color in your eye." There was a watery kitchen mirror hanging above the sink. Frankie looked, but her eyes were gray as they always were. This summer she was grown so tall that she was almost a big freak, and her shoulders were narrow, her legs too long. She wore a pair of blue-black shorts, a BVD undervest, and she was barefooted. Her hair had been cut like a boy's, but had not been cut for a long time and was now not even parted. The reflection in the glass was warped and crooked, but Frankie knew well what she looked like. She drew up her left shoulder and turned her head aside. "Oh," she said, "they were the two prettiest people I ever saw. I just can't understand how it happened." "But what, foolish?" said Bernice. "Your brother came home with the girl he plans to marry and took dinner today with you and your daddy. They intend to marry at her home in Winter Hill this coming Sunday. You and your daddy are going to the wedding, and that is the A and the Z of the matter. So whatever ails you?" "I don't know," said Frankie. "I bet they have a good time every minute of the day." "Let's us have a good time," John Henry said. "Us have a good time?" Frankie asked. "Us?" The three of them sat at the table again, and Bernice dealt the cards for three-handed bridge. Bernice had been the cook since Frankie could remember. She was very black and broad-shouldered and short. She always said that she was 35 years old, but she had been saying that at least 3 years. Her hair was parted, plaited, and greased close to the skull, and she had a flat and quiet face. There was only one thing wrong about Bernice. Her left eye was bright blue glass. It stared out fixed and wild from her quiet colored face, and why she had wanted a blue eye nobody human would ever know. Her right eye was dark and sad. Bernice dealt slowly, licking her thumb when the sweaty cards stuck together. John Henry watched each card as it was being dealt. His chest was white and wet and naked, and he wore around his neck a tiny lead donkey tied by a string. He was blood kin to Frankie, first cousin, and all summer he would eat dinner and spend the day with her, or eat supper and spend the night, and she could not make him go home. He was small to be 6 years old, but he had the largest knees that Frankie had ever seen, and on one of them there was always a scab or a bandage where he had fallen down and skinned himself. John Henry had a little screwed white face, and he wore tiny gold-rimmed glasses. He watched all of the cards very carefully, because he was in debt. He owed Bernice more than $5 million. "I bid one heart," said Bernice. "A spade," said Frankie. "I want to bid spades," said John Henry. "That's what I was going to bid." "Well, that's your tough luck. I bid them first." "Oh, you fool jackass," he said. "It's not fair." "Hush quarreling," said Bernice. "To tell the truth, I don't think either one of you's got such a grand hand to fight over the bid about. I bid two hearts." "I don't give a darn about it," Frankie said. "It is immaterial with me." As a matter of fact, this was so. She played bridge that afternoon like John Henry, just putting down any card that suddenly occurred to her. They sat together in the kitchen, and the kitchen was a sad and ugly room. John Henry had covered the walls with queer child drawings as far up as his arm would reach. This gave the kitchen a crazy look, like that of a room in the crazy house. And now the old kitchen made Frankie sick. The name for what had happened to her, Frankie did not know, but she could feel her squeezed heart beating against the table edge. "The world is certainly a small place," she said. "What makes you say that?" "I mean, sudden," said Frankie. "The world is certainly a sudden place." "Well, I don't know," said Bernice. "Sometimes sudden and sometimes slow." Frankie's eyes were half closed, and to her own ears her voice sounded ragged, far away. "To me, it is sudden." For only yesterday Frankie had never thought seriously about a wedding. She knew that her only brother, Jarvis, was to be married. He had become engaged to a girl in Winter Hill just before he went to Alaska. Jarvis was a corporal in the Army, and he had spent almost 2 years in Alaska. Frankie had not seen her brother for a long, long time, and his face had become masked and changing like a face seen underwater. But Alaska! Frankie had dreamed of it constantly, and especially this summer. It was very real. She saw the snow and frozen sea and ice glaciers, Eskimo igloos and polar bears, and the beautiful northern lights. When Jarvis had first gone to Alaska, she had sent him a box of homemade fudge, packing it carefully and wrapping each piece separately in waxed paper. It had thrilled her to think that her fudge would be eaten in Alaska, and she had a vision of her brother passing it around to furry Eskimos. 3 months later, a thank you letter had come from Jarvis with a $5 bill enclosed. For a while she had mailed candy almost every week, sometimes divinity instead of fudge, but Jarvis did not send her another bill except at Christmas time. Sometimes his short letters to her father disturbed her a little. For instance, this summer he mentioned once that he had been in swimming and that the mosquitoes were something fierce. This letter jarred upon her dream, but after a few days of bewilderment, she returned to her frozen seas and snow. When Jarvis had come back from Alaska, he had gone straight to Winter Hill. The bride was named Janice Evans, and the plans for the wedding were like this. Her brother had wired that he and the bride were coming this Friday to spend the day. Then on the following Sunday, there was to be the wedding at Winter Hill. Frankie and her father were going to the wedding, traveling nearly 100 miles to Winter Hill, and Frankie had already packed a suitcase. She looked forward to the time her brother and the bride should come, but she did not picture them to herself and did not think about the wedding. So on the day before the visit, she only commented to Bernice, "I think it's curious coincidence that Jarvis would get to go to Alaska and that the very bride he picked to marry would come from a place called Winter Hill." Winter Hill, she repeated slowly, her eyes closed, and the name blended with dreams of Alaska and cold snow. "I wish tomorrow was Sunday instead of Friday. I wish I'd already left town." "Sunday will come," said Bernice. "Oh, I doubt it," said Frankie. "I've been ready to leave this town so long. I wish I didn't have to come back here after the wedding. I wish I was going somewhere for good. I wish I had $100 and could just light out and never see this town again." "Seems to me you wish for a lot of things," said Bernice. "I wish I was somebody else except me." So the afternoon before it happened was like the other August afternoons. Frankie had hung around the kitchen. Then toward dark she had gone out into the yard. The Scuppernong arbor behind the house was purple and dark in the twilight. She walked slowly. John Henry West was sitting beneath the August arbor in a wicker chair, his legs crossed and his hands in his pockets. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I'm thinking." "About what?" He did not answer. Frankie was too tall this summer to walk beneath the arbor as she had always done before. Other 12-year-old people could still walk around inside, give shows, and have a good time. Even small grown ladies could walk underneath the arbor. And already Frankie was too big. This year she had to hang around and pick from the edges like the grown people. She stared into the tangle of dark vines, and there was the smell of crushed scuppernongs and dust. Standing beside the arbor, with dark coming on, Frankie was afraid. She did not know what caused this fear, but she was afraid. "I'll tell you what," she said. "Suppose you eat supper and spend the night with me." John Henry took his dollar watch from his pocket and looked at it as though the time would decide whether or not he would come. But it was too dark under the arbor for him to read the numbers. "Go on home and tell Aunt Pet. I'll meet you in the kitchen." "All right." She was afraid. The evening sky was pale and empty, and the light from the kitchen window made a yellow square reflection in the darkening yard. She remembered that when she was a little girl, she believed that 3 ghosts were living in the coal house, and one of the ghosts wore a silver ring. She ran up the back steps and said, "I just now invited John Henry to eat supper and spend the night with me." Bernice was kneading a lump of biscuit dough, and she dropped it on the flour-dusted table. "I thought you were sick and tired of him." "I am sick and tired of him," said Frankie. "But it seemed to me he looked scared." "Scared of what?" Frankie shook her head. "Maybe I mean lonesome," she said finally. "Well, I'll save him a scrap of dough." After the darkening yard, the kitchen was hot and bright and queer. The walls of the kitchen bothered Frankie. The queer drawings of Christmas trees, airplanes, freaked soldiers, flowers. John Henry had started the first pictures one long afternoon in June, and having already ruined the wall, he went on and drew whenever he wished. Sometimes Frankie had drawn also. At first her father had been furious about the walls, but later he said for them to draw all the pictures out of their systems, and he would have the kitchen painted in the fall. But as the summer lasted and would not end, the walls had begun to bother Frankie. That evening the kitchen looked strange to her, and she was afraid. She stood in the doorway and said, "I just thought I might as well invite him." So at dark, John Henry came to the back door with a little weekend bag. He was dressed in his white recital suit and had put on shoes and socks. There was a dagger buckled to his belt. John Henry had seen snow. Although he was only 6 years old, he had gone to Birmingham last winter, and there he had seen snow. Frankie had never seen snow. "I'll take the weekend bag," said Frankie. "You can start right in making a biscuit man." Okay. John Henry did not play with the dough. He worked on the biscuit man as though it were a very serious business. Now and then he stopped off, settled his glasses with his little hand, and studied what he had done. He was like a tiny watchmaker, and he drew up a chair and knelt on it so he could get directly over the work. When Bernice gave him some raisins, he did not stick them all around as any other human child would do. He used only two for the eyes. But immediately he realized they were too large, so he divided one raisin carefully and put in eyes, two specks for the nose, and a little grinning raisin mouth. When he had finished, he wiped his hands on the seat of his shorts, and there was a little biscuit man with separate fingers, a hat on, and even walking stick. John Henry had worked so hard that the dough was now gray and wet. But it was a perfect little biscuit man. And, as a matter of fact, it reminded Frankie of John Henry himself. "I'd better entertain you now," she said. They ate supper at the kitchen table with Bernice, since her father had telephoned that he was working late at his jewelry store. When Bernice brought the biscuit man from the oven, they saw that it looked exactly like any other biscuit man ever made by a child. It had swelled so that all the work of John Henry had been cooked out. The fingers were run together, and the walking stick resembled a sort of tail. But John Henry just looked at it through his glasses, wiped it with his napkin, and buttered the left foot. It was a dark, hot August night. The radio in the dining room was playing a mixture of many stations. A war voice crossed with the gabble of an advertiser, and underneath there was the sleazy music of a sweet band. The radio had stayed on all the summer long, so finally it was a sound that, as a rule, they did not notice. Sometimes, when the noise became so loud that they could not hear their own ears, Frankie would turn it down a little. Otherwise, music and voices came and went and crossed and twisted with each other, and by August they did not listen any more. "What do you want to do?" asked Frankie. "Would you like for me to read to you out of Hans Brinker, or would you rather do something else?" "I'd rather do something else," he said. "What?" "Let's play out." "I don't want to," Frankie said. "There's a big crowd going to play out tonight." "You got ears," Frankie said. "You heard me." John Henry stood with his big knees locked. Then finally he said, "I think I'd better go home." "Why, you haven't spent the night. You can't eat supper and just go off like that." "I know it," he said quietly. Along with the radio, they could hear the voices of the children playing in the night. "But let's go out, Frankie. They sound like they're having a mighty good time." "No, they're not," she said. "Just a lot of ugly, silly children running and hollering. Nothing to it. We'll go upstairs and unpack your weekend bag." Frankie's room was an elevated sleeping porch which had been built onto the house, with a stairway leading up from the kitchen. The room was furnished with an iron bed, a bureau, and a desk. Also, Frankie had a motor which could be turned on and off. The motor could sharpen knives, and, if they were long enough, it could be used for filing down your fingernails. Against the wall was the suitcase packed and ready for the trip to Winter Hill. On the desk, there was a very old typewriter, and Frankie sat down before it, trying to think of any letters she could write. But there was nobody for her to write to, as every possible letter had already been answered, and answered even several times. So she covered the typewriter with her raincoat and pushed it aside. "Honestly," John Henry said, "don't you think I'd better go home?" "No," she answered without looking around at him. "You sit there in the corner and play with the motor." Before Frankie there were now two objects, a lavender seashell and a glass globe with snow inside that could be shaken into a snowstorm. When she held the seashell to her ear, she could hear the warm wash of the Gulf of Mexico and think of a green palm island far away. And she could hold the snow globe to her narrowed eyes and watch the whirling white flakes fall until they blinded her. She dreamed of Alaska. She walked up a cold white hill and looked on a snowy wasteland far below. She watched the sun make colors in the ice and heard dream voices, saw dream things, and everywhere there was the cold, white, gentle snow. "Look," John Henry said, and he was staring out of the window. I think those big girls are having a party in their clubhouse. Hush, Frankie screamed suddenly. Don't mention those crooks to me. There was in the neighborhood a clubhouse, and Frankie was not a member. The members of the club were girls who were 13 and 14 and even 15 years old. They had parties with boys on Saturday night. Frankie knew all of the club members, and until this summer she had been like a younger member of their crowd. But now they had this club, and she was not a member. They had said she was too young and mean. On Saturday night she could hear the terrible music and see from far away their light. Sometimes she went around to the alley behind the clubhouse and stood near a honeysuckle fence. She stood in the alley and watched and listened. They were very long, those parties. Maybe they will change their mind and invite you, John Henry said. The sons of bitches. Frankie sniffled and wiped her nose in the crook of her arm. She sat down on the edge of the bed, her shoulders slumped and her elbows resting on her knees. I think they have been spreading it all over town that I smell bad, she said. When I had those boils and that black bitter-smelling ointment, old Helen Fletcher asked what was that funny smell I had. Oh, I could shoot every one of them with a pistol. She heard John Henry walking up to the bed, and then she felt his hand patting her neck with tiny little pats. I don't think you smell so bad, he said. You smell sweet. The sons of bitches, she said again. And there was something else. They were talking nasty lies about married people. When I think of Aunt Pet and Uncle Eustace and my own father, the nasty lies, I don't know what kind of fool they take me for. I can smell you the minute you walk into the house without even looking to see if it's you, like 100 flowers. I don't care, she said. I just don't care. Like 1,000 flowers, said John Henry, and still he was patting his sticky hand on the back of her bent neck. Frankie sat up, licked the tears from around her mouth, and wiped off her face with her shirt tail. She sat still, her nose widened, smelling herself. Then she went to her suitcase and took out a bottle of sweet serenade. She rubbed some on the top of her head and poured some more down inside the neck of her shirt. You want some on you? John Henry was squatting beside her open suitcase, and he gave a little shiver when she poured the perfume over him. He wanted to meddle in her traveling suitcase and look carefully at everything she owned, but Frankie only wanted him to get a general impression, and not count and not know just what she had and what she did not have. So she strapped the suitcase and pushed it back against the wall. Boy, she said, I bet I use more perfume than anybody in this town. The house was quiet except for the low rumble of the radio in the dining room downstairs. Long ago, her father had come home and Bernice had closed the back door and gone away. There was no longer the sound of children's voices in the summer night. I guess we ought to have a good time, said Frankie. But there was nothing to do. John Henry stood, his knees locked and his hands clasped behind his back in the middle of the room. There were moths at the window, pale green moths and yellow moths that fluttered and spread their wings against the screen. Those beautiful butterflies, he said. They're trying to get in. Frankie watched the soft moths tremble and press against the window screen. The moths came every evening when the lamp on her desk was lighted. They came from out of the August night and fluttered and clung against the screen. To me, it is the irony of fate, she said. The way they come here, those moths could fly anywhere. Yet they keep hanging around the windows of this house. John Henry touched the gold rim of his glasses to settle them on his nose, and Frankie studied his flat little freckled face. Take off those glasses, she said suddenly. John Henry took them off and blew on them. She looked through the glasses, and the room was loose and crooked. Then she pushed back her chair and stared at John Henry. There were 2 damp white circles around his eyes. I bet you don't need those glasses, she said. She put her hand down on the typewriter. What is this? The typewriter, he said. Frankie picked up the shell. And this? The shell from the bag. What is this little thing crawling there on the floor? Where? he asked, looking around him. That little thing crawling around near your feet. Oh, he said. He squatted down. Why, it's an ant. I wonder how it got up here. Frankie tilted back in her chair and crossed her bare feet on her desk. If I were you, I'd just throw those glasses away, she said. You can see as good as anybody. John Henry did not answer. They don't look becoming. She handed the folded glasses to John Henry, and he wiped them with his pink flannel glasses rag. He put them back on and did not answer. Okay, she said. Suit yourself. I was only telling you for your own good. They went to bed. They undressed with their backs turned to each other, and then Frankie switched off the motor and the light. John Henry knelt down to say his prayers, and he prayed for a long time, not saying the words aloud. Then he lay down beside her. Good night, she said. Good night. Frankie stared up into the dark. You know, it's still hard for me to realize that the world turns around at the rate of about 1,000 miles an hour. I know it, he said. And to understand why it is that when you jump up in the air, you don't come down in Fairview or Selma or somewhere 50 miles away. John Henry turned over and made a sleepy sound. Or Winter Hill, she said. I wish I was starting for Winter Hill right now. Already John Henry was asleep. She heard him breathe in the darkness, and now she had what she had wanted so many nights that summer. There was somebody sleeping in bed with her. She lay in the dark and listened to him breathe. Then after a while she raised herself on her elbow. He lay freckled and small in the moonlight, his chest white and naked, and one foot hanging from the edge of the bed. Carefully, she put her hand on his stomach and moved closer. It felt as though a little clock was ticking inside him, and he smelled of sweat and sweet serenade. He smelled like a sour little rose. Frankie leaned down and licked him behind the ear. Then she breathed deeply, settled herself with her chin on his sharp, damp shoulder, and closed her eyes. For now, with somebody sleeping in the dark with her, she was not so much afraid. The sun woke them early in the next morning, the white August sun. Frankie could not make John Henry go home. He saw the ham Bernice was cooking, and that special company dinner was going to be good. Frankie's father read the paper in the living room, then went downtown to wind the watches at his jewelry store. If that brother of mine don't bring me a present from Alaska, I will be seriously mad, said Frankie. Me too, agreed John Henry. And what were they doing that August morning when her brother and bride came home? They were sitting in the arbor shade and talking about Christmas. The glare was hard and bright. The sun-drunk blue jays screamed and murdered among themselves. They talked, and their voices tired down into a little tune, and they said the same things over and over. They just drowsed in the dark shade of the arbor, and Frankie was a person who had never thought about a wedding. That was the way they were that August morning when her brother and the bride walked in the house. Oh, Jesus, Frankie said. The cards on the table were greasy and the late sun slanted across the yard. The world is certainly a sudden place. Well, stop commenting about it, said Bernice. You don't have your mind on the game. Frankie, however, had some of her mind on the game. She played the queen of spades, which were trumps, and John Henry threw off a little two of diamonds. She looked at him. He was staring at the back of her hand as though what he wanted and needed was angled eyesight that could cut around corners and read people's cards. You got a spade, said Frankie. John Henry put his donkey necklace in his mouth and looked away. Cheater, she said. Go on and play your spade, said Bernice. Then he argued. It was hid behind the other card. Cheater. But still he would not play. He sat there, sad and holding up the game. Make haste, said Bernice. I can't, he said finally. It's a jack, the only spade I got